Welcome back, dear listener, to another soft-spoken stroll through the shadows of the past. Whether your night is just beginning or you're listening as sleep arrives, I'm glad you've chosen to spend this time with me. Let me know in the comments if you're tuning in from somewhere quiet or from the heart of a busy city winding down. If these calming explorations help you relax, please consider subscribing. There are countless voices from the past still waiting to be heard. Now, settle into your favorite chair, close your eyes if you like, and let your mind drift back to a time when power was measured not just in votes or wealth, but in bloodlines, marriages, and the delicate balance of medieval politics. Tonight, we explore what life was really like for the queens of the Middle Ages, not the romanticized figures of fairy tales, but real women navigating a world that was often as dangerous as it was magnificent. Picture a young woman, perhaps 14 or 15 years old. She grew up in a castle, surrounded by luxuries that most of her subjects couldn't imagine. Yet, as she stands before a polished silver mirror, dressed by her ladies-in-waiting, she understands that her life is not truly her own. Her marriage has been arranged since childhood, a political alliance sealed with her body and future. She may have never met her husband or even speak his language, but in a few hours or days, she will become a queen in a foreign land. This was the reality for countless medieval queens. Marriage was rarely about love or compatibility. It was diplomacy by other means. Take Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the 12th century. At 15, she married Louis VI of France. This union aimed to strengthen both realms. But Eleanor was no passive pawn. She was intelligent, educated, and had a strong will that shaped European politics for decades. Yet even Eleanor, for all her power and influence, lived under constraints that might seem suffocating to us today. Medieval queens were expected to be pious, modest, and above all, fertile. Their primary duty was to produce male heirs to secure succession. The pressure was immense. Failure to bear children, or worse, only having daughters, could lead to accusations of divine displeasure, political instability, or even annulment. Consider a medieval queen's daily routine. She would wake before dawn, not to birds singing in a quiet garden, but to the sound of servants preparing for the elaborate rituals of royal life. Every movement was choreographed, from her dressing order to the ceremonies she attended. Privacy was nearly non-existent. Even her bedchamber was often filled with ladies-in-waiting, courtiers, and servants. The morning began with prayers. As medieval queens were expected to be paragons of Christian virtue, they attended Mass, sometimes multiple times each day. Their religious devotion was often as much a public show as a private belief. After prayers came the complex task of holding court, receiving petitioners, and managing the intricate relationships that kept a medieval kingdom functioning. Perhaps the most challenging aspect was constant scrutiny. Every word, every gesture, every favor shown or withheld, was analyzed for political meaning. A queen lived on a stage, always performing her role, and rarely able to be herself. The slightest misstep could trigger rumors or conspiracies. Medieval queens also faced unique dangers that their male counterparts rarely encountered. Childbirth was perilous in an age without modern medicine, and queens were expected to risk their lives repeatedly to secure succession. Many died young, worn out by constant pregnancies and the stress of their position. Those who survived often found themselves vulnerable to accusations of witchcraft or adultery if they failed to produce expected heirs. Yet, within these constraints, many medieval queens found ways to exert real power and influence. They became patrons of the arts, founded monasteries, and commissioned great works of literature and architecture. They served as regents for their minor children, ruling kingdoms on their own, and like Matilda of Tuscany or Eleanor of Aquitaine, even led armies into battle. The court itself was a complex ecosystem that queens had to navigate with skill. Surrounded by nobles who might be allies one day and enemies the next, they mastered the subtle arts of diplomacy, knowing when to show favor and when to hold back. A medieval queen's survival often depended on her ability to read the shifting currents of court politics and position herself wisely. As our imaginary young queen goes through her daily rituals, attended by servants whose loyalty she can never fully trust, she embodies both the privileges and burdens of queenship. She may wear cloth of gold and dine from silver plates, but she is also a prisoner of her position, her life shaped by forces beyond her control. This was the reality behind the crown, not the fairy tale of happily ever after, but a complex, often difficult existence where survival demanded intelligence, adaptability, and courage. In the episodes to come, we'll delve deeper into these remarkable women's lives, exploring their struggles, their triumphs, and the lasting mark they left on history. For now, let these images settle in your mind. As you drift towards sleep, you might hear the rustle of silk gowns on stone floors, the flicker of candlelight on ancient walls, and the quiet strength of women who shaped the course of nations from within the gilded constraints of medieval queenship. Part 2. The daily grind of royal life. As the first rays of dawn crept through the ornate windows of the castle, Queen Isabella stirred from her slumber. This was not the gentle awakening of a life of leisure that many might imagine. Instead, it marked the start of another day filled with rigid protocols, endless ceremonies, and the heavy burden of constant observation. The medieval Queen's Day began not with personal choice, but with the unavoidable demands of court ritual. Before she could even dress, a procession of ladies-in-waiting entered her chambers, each with a specific role in the elaborate morning ceremony. The simple act of getting dressed became a choreographed performance, with certain nobles honored. To present each garment, the queen could not simply reach for her favorite gown. Each piece of clothing was selected according to the day's events, the season, the political climate, and the message her royal wardrobe needed to convey. Consider the morning routine of Eleanor of Aquitaine during her time as Queen of France. Even as one of the most powerful women in medieval Europe, her day began at dawn with prayers in her private chapel, followed by a formal dressing ceremony that could take over an hour. The weight of her ceremonial robes, heavy with gold thread and precious stones, served as a constant reminder of her position's burdens. These garments were not chosen for comfort or personal preference, but as statements of royal authority and divine appointment. The queen's breakfast, too, was far from private. Even this basic human need became a public spectacle, with designated courtiers overseeing the royal meal. Food tasters ensured her safety, but that also meant every bite was carefully watched and reported. The queen could not simply enjoy her food. She had to be aware that her appetite, preferences, and manner of eating would be discussed throughout the court and interpreted as signs of her health, mood, or political leanings. The morning audience was perhaps the most taxing part of her daily routine. Queens were expected to hold court, receiving petitioners, hearing grievances, and making decisions that affected countless lives. Unlike a modern executive who might have advisors and time to think, the medieval queen had to show wisdom and justice on the spot, often in matters of life and death. These were not ceremonial duties. They came with real responsibilities and enormous consequences. Take Queen Matilda of England, who spent hours each morning hearing cases from nobles disputing land rights, merchants seeking trade privileges, and commoners requesting royal intervention in local disputes. Each decision had to balance competing interests while maintaining the delicate web of alliances that kept her in power. A single poorly judged ruling could spark a rebellion or lose the support of crucial allies. The administrative burden was overwhelming. Medieval queens were not merely figureheads. They had to grasp the complex financial systems of their kingdoms, manage large household staff, oversee the education and marriages of noble children, and maintain correspondence with other royal courts across Europe. Queen Blanche of Castile, mother of Louis IX of France, often worked late into the night, handling everything from military supplies to monastery endowments. The physical toll of this lifestyle was severe. Queens were constantly in the public eye, required to maintain perfect posture and composure, even when ill or grieving. They could not show weakness, have bad days, or even scratch an itch without it being noted and potentially misinterpreted. The elaborate court dress, while magnificent, was also physically restrictive, with tight bodices, heavy fabrics, and undergarments that made simple movement challenging. Privacy was a luxury that simply did not exist. Queens were always accompanied by ladies-in-waiting, guards, and various court officials. They could not take a walk alone, write a letter without it being intercepted and read, or have a private conversation without risking that it would be overheard and reported. Even their most intimate moments were subject to scrutiny. Royal pregnancies were matters of state, with court physicians monitoring every aspect of the queen's health. The timing of conception was often planned according to political needs. The emotional isolation was perhaps the cruelest aspect of royal life. Queens were surrounded by people all day, yet true friendship was nearly impossible. Everyone who approached them wanted something: favor, advancement, protection, or simply the prestige of royal attention. True confidants were rare and dangerous. Trusting the wrong person could lead to political ruin or even death. Many queens developed close relationships with their confessors, as these were among the few individuals bound by religious vows to keep their secrets. Queen Marguerite of Provence, wife of Louis IX, wrote in her private prayers about the terrible solitude of the crown, describing how she was constantly surrounded by people. She felt completely alone. She couldn't share her fears about her children's health without it turning into a state concern. She couldn't voice doubts about political decisions without threatening royal authority. She couldn't even mourn properly when she lost children in infancy, as royal mourning had to follow strict rules. The pressure to produce male heirs added another layer of stress to daily life. Queens understood that their main value was in their ability to secure succession. Each month that passed without a pregnancy brought them closer to potential political disaster. The medieval view of conception placed the blame entirely on the woman. Therefore, infertility or giving birth to daughters was seen as the queen's failure. This biological pressure intertwined with political necessity in ways that modern people can hardly grasp. Isabella of France, Queen of Edward II of England, faced years of speculation over her inability to conceive. Early in her marriage, court doctors subjected her to humiliating exams and prescribed treatments that were often uncomfortable or dangerous. They constantly tracked her menstrual cycles. When she finally became pregnant, every part of her pregnancy was managed by a team of doctors, midwives, and court officials. They saw her not as a person, but as a vessel for the kingdom's future. The queen's relationships with her children were complicated by royal demands. Children were often raised mainly by wet nurses and tutors, with queens seeing them only during formal events. Royal children were not just beloved offspring. They were political tools to be educated, married off, and used to serve dynastic goals. The instinct to protect and nurture clashed with the need to use children for alliances and to secure the kingdom's future. Even leisure activities were limited by royal expectations. Queens couldn't just pursue enjoyable hobbies. Their interests had to align with royal dignity and political goals. They were expected to be skilled in music, literature, and needlework, not for personal joy, but to show royal refinement to visiting dignitaries. Hunting, one of the few physical activities available to noblewomen, came with strict rules about when, where, and with whom the queen could partake. This constant performance was draining. Every gesture, expression, and word was scrutinized for meaning. Queens had to master the art of saying little while seeming to say a lot. They needed to show interest without commitment and display emotion without losing control. They were trained from a young age to be living symbols instead of authentic human beings. Religious obligations added more weight to their daily burden. Queens were expected to model Christian virtue by attending multiple services, participating in religious festivals, and showing piety through charitable work. However, even their relationship with God was public and political. Their prayers were watched. Their charitable donations were calculated for political gain. Their religious practices were used to enhance royal legitimacy. The administrative work was immense. Queens managed household budgets that would dwarf those of modern corporations, oversaw hundreds of staff, and maintained complex networks of patronage and obligation. They had to grasp law, finance, diplomacy, and military strategy well enough to make informed decisions. Yet, they received little formal education in these areas, learning mainly through observation and experience, often making costly mistakes. While the kingdom watched, despite these constraints, many medieval queens found ways to wield real power. They learned to work within the system's limitations, using their positions to advance causes they believed in, protect vulnerable subjects, and sometimes challenge policies they disagreed with. However, this influence came at the cost of a normal human life. The tragedy of the medieval queen's life was that in gaining a crown, she lost herself. The woman beneath the royal surface was often forgotten, buried under layers of protocol, expectation, and political necessity. Recognizing this reality helps us appreciate the remarkable resilience and intelligence of women who not only survived this system but sometimes thrived within it. They left lasting impacts on their kingdoms and on history itself. Their daily lives were a constant balancing act between personal desires and public duties, between human needs and royal obligations, between who they might have been and who they had to be. In this tension lay both the source of their power and the cause of their suffering. creating lives of complex magnificence that challenge our modern assumptions about medieval queenship. As queens navigated these treacherous political waters, their most fundamental duty remained starkly simple: produce a male heir. This biological imperative overshadowed every aspect of their lives. It turned their bodies into vessels for dynastic survival and their wombs into battlefields where the fate of kingdoms hung in the balance. Pressure to conceive began immediately after marriage, often when these queens were still teenagers. Court physicians, astrologers, and midwives examined every aspect of their health, diet, and behavior. They were given special foods thought to encourage conception, subjected to bloodletting to balance their humors, and forced to endure treatments that ranged from uncomfortable to genuinely dangerous. Holy relics were placed beneath their beds, prayers were offered at shrines, and pilgrimages were made, all fueled by the desperate hope for pregnancy. When conception did happen, the queen's life became even more regulated and observed. Every movement was monitored, her diet closely controlled, and her activities severely restricted. She was surrounded by female attendants whose job was to ensure that nothing went wrong during the crucial months of pregnancy. The fate of the realm literally grew within her belly, and everyone was aware of it. However, pregnancy in medieval times was dangerous for many women. Without modern medical knowledge or sterile conditions, complications were common and often fatal. Queens died in childbirth at alarming rates, their lives sacrificed for dynastic needs. Even those who survived childbirth faced the heartbreak of infant mortality, which claimed countless royal children before their first birthday. Take the tragic case of Jane Seymour, Henry V's third wife. She finally gave Henry the male heir he craved, but died of complications just 12 days after giving birth to the future Edward VI. Her joy in producing a son became her death sentence, and her brief fulfillment of her primary duty as queen came at great cost. The psychological burden of these expectations was immense. Queens who failed to conceive or who had only daughters lived under the constant threat of divorce, annulment, or worse. They watched their husbands take mistresses, knowing any illegitimate son could threaten their own place. They endured the whispers of courtiers who blamed them for the lack of a male heir, as if they controlled their children's sex. Catherine of Aragon experienced this agony for decades. Married to Henry VIII for over 20 years, she faced multiple pregnancies, miscarriages, and stillbirths. Only one child, Mary, survived to adulthood. The king's frustration with her failure to produce a son ultimately led to the English Reformation, as Henry broke with Rome to divorce Catherine and marry Anne Boleyn. Catherine spent her final years in exile, stripped of her title and separated from her daughter, all because her body failed to provide the male heir that politics demanded. Anne Boleyn herself faced the same crushing pressure. Despite her intelligence, wit, and political skill, her inability to give Henry a son sealed her fate. After producing only Elizabeth, she too was cast aside, though her end was far more dramatic and violent than Catherine's lonely exile. The executioner's sword that ended her life was, in many ways, the logical outcome of a system that valued queens solely for their ability to reproduce. Even queens who did produce male heirs found their troubles were not over. Medieval medicine knew little about spacing pregnancies or women's health, so queens were expected to continue having children throughout their fertile years. Each pregnancy brought new risks, and the exhausting cycle of conception, pregnancy, birth, and recovery took a heavy toll on their bodies and minds. Isabella of Castile, one of history's most successful female rulers, bore 5 children while governing a kingdom and funding Christopher Columbus's voyages to the New World. The physical and emotional strain of constant pregnancy while managing state affairs was immense. Yet she had no choice but to keep going. Her body belonged not to herself, but to the crown and the dynasty she served. The medieval view of women's bodies made these expectations even more burdensome. Medical texts of the time described women as essentially defective men, ruled by unstable humors and prone to hysteria. When queens failed to conceive, it was often blamed on moral failings or divine disfavor, rather than simple biology. They faced increasingly desperate treatments, from special diets to painful procedures, all intended to fix what was seen as their fundamental inadequacy. Ironically, medieval science had no understanding of the male role in determining a child's sex. Queens were blamed for having daughters, when it was actually the father's contribution that determined gender. Countless women suffered disgrace, divorce, and even death for a biological reality entirely beyond their control, yet even in a system designed to reduce them to breeding stock, some queens found ways to assert their importance. They used their pregnancies as chances to negotiate for better treatment or political concessions. They carefully timed announcements for maximum political benefit. They built loyal female networks that provided support and protection during their vulnerable moments. Eleanor of Aquitaine, who bore 8 children across 2 marriages, never let motherhood diminish her political influence. She used her pregnancies strategically, ensuring each child strengthened her position and expanded her power. Even in her 70s, long past the age of childbearing, she remained a significant political figure. Pressure to conceive began immediately after marriage, often when these queens were still teenagers. Court physicians, astrologers, and midwives examined every aspect of their health, diet, and behavior. They were given special foods thought to encourage conception, subjected to bloodletting to balance their humors, and forced to endure treatments that ranged from uncomfortable to genuinely dangerous. Holy relics were placed beneath their beds, prayers were offered at shrines, and pilgrimages were made, all fueled by the desperate hope for pregnancy. When conception did happen, the queen's life became even more regulated and observed. Every movement was monitored, her diet closely controlled, and her activities severely restricted. She was surrounded by female attendants whose job was to ensure that nothing went wrong during the crucial months of pregnancy. The fate of the realm literally grew within her belly, and everyone was aware of it. However, pregnancy in medieval times was dangerous for many women. Without modern medical knowledge or sterile conditions, complications were common and often fatal. Queens died in childbirth at alarming rates, their lives sacrificed for dynastic needs. Even those who survived childbirth faced the heartbreak of infant mortality, which claimed countless royal children before their first birthday. Take the tragic case of Jane Seymour, Henry V's third wife. She finally gave Henry the male heir he craved, but died of complications just 12 days after giving birth to the future Edward VI. Her joy in producing a son became her death sentence, and her brief fulfillment of her primary duty as queen came at great cost. The psychological burden of these expectations was immense. Queens who failed to conceive or who had only daughters lived under the constant threat of divorce, annulment, or worse. They watched their husbands take mistresses, knowing any illegitimate son could threaten their own place. They endured the whispers of courtiers who blamed them for the lack of a male heir, as if they controlled their children's sex. Catherine of Aragon experienced this agony for decades. Married to Henry VIII for over 20 years, she faced multiple pregnancies, miscarriages, and stillbirths. Only one child, Mary, survived to adulthood. The king's frustration with her failure to produce a son ultimately led to the English Reformation. As Henry broke with Rome to divorce Catherine and marry Anne Boleyn, Catherine spent her final years in exile, stripped of her title and separated from her daughter, all because her body failed to provide the male heir that politics demanded. Anne Boleyn herself faced the same crushing pressure. Despite her intelligence, wit, and political skill, her inability to give Henry a son sealed her fate. After producing only Elizabeth, she too was cast aside, though her end was far more dramatic and violent than Catherine's lonely exile. The executioner's sword that ended her life was, in many ways, the logical outcome of a system that valued queens solely for their ability to reproduce. Even queens who did produce male heirs found their troubles were not over. Medieval medicine knew little about spacing pregnancies or women's health, so queens were expected to continue having children throughout their fertile years. Each pregnancy brought new risks, and the exhausting cycle of conception, pregnancy, birth, and recovery took a heavy toll on their bodies and minds. Isabella of Castile, one of history's most successful female rulers, bore 5 children while governing a kingdom and funding Christopher Columbus's voyages to the New World. The physical and emotional strain of constant pregnancy while managing state affairs was immense. Yet she had no choice but to keep going. Her body belonged not to herself, but to the crown and the dynasty she served. The medieval view of women's bodies made these expectations even more burdensome. Medical texts of the time described women as essentially defective men, ruled by unstable humors and prone to hysteria. When queens failed to conceive, it was often blamed on moral failings or divine disfavor, rather than simple biology. They faced increasingly desperate treatments, from special diets to painful procedures, all intended to fix what was seen as their fundamental inadequacy. Ironically, medieval science had no understanding of the male role in determining a child's sex. Queens were blamed for having daughters, when it was actually the father's contribution that determined gender. Countless women suffered disgrace, divorce, and even death for a biological reality entirely beyond their control, yet even in a system designed to reduce them to breeding stock, some queens found ways to assert their importance. They used their pregnancies as chances to negotiate for better treatment or political concessions. They carefully timed announcements for maximum political benefit. They built loyal female networks that provided support and protection during their vulnerable moments. Eleanor of Aquitaine, who bore 8 children across 2 marriages, never let motherhood diminish her political influence. She used her pregnancies strategically, ensuring each child strengthened her position and expanded her power. Even in her 70s, long past the age of childbearing, she remained a significant political figure. Old enough to understand their circumstances, they had no power to refuse their fate. Margaret of Anjou was 15 when she was betrothed to the mentally unstable King Henry VI of England. The marriage was arranged to secure an alliance between England and France, but Margaret found herself married to a man who suffered from complete mental breakdowns. This left her to essentially rule England while caring for a husband who sometimes didn't even recognize her. She spent decades fighting civil wars to protect her son's inheritance, while maintaining the illusion that her incapacitated husband was still capable of ruling. The emotional toll of these arranged marriages was devastating. Queens were expected to love, honor, and obey husbands they had never met, men who were often decades older, sometimes cruel, and occasionally completely unsuitable as partners. They had to share their beds with strangers, bear children for men they might despise, and remain gracious through it all, while representing the dignity of their royal houses. Many queens never saw their homelands again after marriage. They were sent off to foreign courts where they didn't speak the language, didn't understand the customs, and had no allies. Anne of Cleves traveled from Germany to England to marry King Henry VIII, only for him to declare their marriage null and void after just 6 months because he found her physically unappealing. She spent the rest of her life in exile, neither married nor unmarried, completely dependent on the king's charity. The idea of romantic love, while celebrated in literature and song, was seen as dangerous and inappropriate for royalty. Queens who showed too much affection for their husbands were viewed with suspicion, while those seeking love elsewhere faced accusations of adultery that could lead to execution. The court of love, poetry, and chivalric romance that we associate with medieval times was largely a fantasy. It offered an escape from the harsh realities of political marriages and loveless unions. Some queens sought emotional fulfillment through passionate friendships or spiritual devotion, but even these relationships were closely examined and often used against them. Eleanor of Aquitaine's close relationships with various nobles and clergy were constantly questioned, and her fierce independence eventually led to her imprisonment by her own husband, King Henry II, for 16 years. The pressure to maintain a perfect marriage facade was enormous. Queens were expected to appear devoted to their husbands in public, regardless of how they were treated in private. They had to smile and act like the happy wife even when their husbands took mistresses, spent their dowries on wars, or treated them with contempt. Any sign of marital discord was seen as a failure of the queen's duty and could justify setting her aside. When marriages failed, it was almost always the queen who bore the consequences. Kings could seek annulments, claim their wives were barren, or simply take new wives while imprisoning or executing the old ones. Queens had no such options. They could not divorce, could not remarry, and could not return to their families without causing international incidents. They were trapped in marriages that were often little more than gilded cages. The rare queens who found genuine love faced their own unique challenges. When they married for love instead of politics, they were criticized for putting personal desires above royal duty. Their children's legitimacy might be questioned, their political alliances weakened, and their reputations destroyed. Love for a medieval queen was not a blessing, but a dangerous liability that could ruin everything she had worked to build. Even widowhood, which might seem like freedom, came with its own restrictions. Widowed queens were valuable for marriage once again. Their experience and connections made them attractive to ambitious nobles seeking to advance their political fortunes. Many were forced into second or third marriages against their will, their mourning periods cut short by political necessity. The emotional isolation experienced by medieval queens was profound and lasting. They lived surrounded by people, but were truly intimate with no one. Their ladies-in-waiting could be potential spies, their confessors reported to the church hierarchy, and their children were often raised by others and seen primarily as political assets. Even their most private moments were subject to scrutiny. Their correspondence was read, their movements monitored, and their conversations reported back to their husbands or their husbands' advisors. This isolation was made worse by the fact that queens were often foreigners in their adopted lands. They were forever marked as outsiders, regardless of how long they lived there or how well they served their new countries. They were expected to completely abandon their native cultures, languages, and customs, while never being fully accepted by their new subjects. They existed in a permanent state of displacement, belonging fully neither to their birth families nor to their married households. The psychological impact of this isolation cannot be overstated. Many queens showed signs of what we would now recognize as depression, anxiety, and other mental health issues. They had no one to confide in, no one to seek comfort from, and no way to express their true feelings without risking political consequences. They were expected to be paragons of virtue and strength while dealing with challenges that would break most people. Religious devotion led some to spend hours in prayer and meditation as a way to cope with their circumstances. Others focused on charitable works, finding purpose in helping people even when they couldn't help themselves. A few turned to learning and scholarship, becoming patrons of artists and writers who could express the emotions they had to keep hidden. The most tragic aspect of medieval queenship was how these intelligent, capable women had to suppress their own personalities and desires to fulfill their royal roles. They could never simply be themselves. They had to be symbols, representatives, and political tools. Their worth was measured not by their character, intelligence, or accomplishments, but by their ability to produce male heirs and maintain peaceful relationships with foreign powers. Yet, despite these constraints and hardships, medieval queens showed remarkable resilience. They found ways to exert influence and create meaning in their lives. They became skilled at subtle political maneuvering, using their positions to protect their children, advance causes they believed in, and sometimes shape the course of history. Their stories remind us that even in the most restrictive circumstances, the human spirit finds ways to endure, adjust, and sometimes thrive. The legacy of these medieval queens reaches far beyond their individual stories. They set precedents for female leadership that would influence royal traditions for centuries. They supported the arts and learning that enriched their cultures. They navigated impossible political situations with grace and intelligence. They bore the weight of expectations that no one should have to carry, doing so with a dignity that commands our respect and admiration across the ages. Looking at the reference materials and the script summary you've provided, I'll continue with part 5 of the Medieval Queen script. I will maintain the contemplative tone and text-to-speech friendly format while exploring the political aspects of queenship beyond the limits of birthing chambers and the scrutiny of reproductive expectations. Medieval queens had to navigate a complex web of political alliances and court intrigues, which would challenge even the most seasoned diplomats. The queen's political role was a delicate balancing act between wielding influence and maintaining the appearance of feminine submission that medieval society demanded. A queen's political education often started in childhood, though rarely through formal instruction. Instead, it came from observing the women around her. She learned how to maneuver through conversations, plant suggestions instead of giving commands, and build loyalty through gifts, favors, and strategic kindness. These were the tools of queenly power, subtle yet effective in shaping policy without directly challenging male authority. The medieval court was a complex ecosystem where every gesture had meaning, every conversation had potential consequences, and every alliance could change with the seasons. Queens learned to read the subtle signs of court life like scholars read ancient texts. They understood that a courtier's absence from morning prayers might signal changing loyalties, that the seating arrangement at a feast could reveal favor or disfavor more clearly than any proclamation, and that choosing which ladies to include in private talks could determine the success or failure of delicate negotiations. Eleanor of Aquitaine stands out as a remarkable example of a medieval queen who mastered political maneuvering. Born into wealth and power as the Duchess of Aquitaine, Eleanor brought vast territories to her marriages, first with Louis VI of France and then with Henry II of England. Her story illustrates both the potential power and constant dangers faced by politically active queens. Eleanor's early years as Queen of France showed the challenges even privileged medieval women faced. Despite her substantial lands, she faced constant criticism for her independence, fashion, and inability to quickly produce a male heir. The French court viewed her Aquitanian customs with suspicion, seeing her love for poetry and music as frivolous, her colorful clothing as inappropriate, and her outspoken nature as unseemly for a queen. When Eleanor accompanied Louis on the Second Crusade, she demonstrated both the possibilities and dangers of queenly involvement in military campaigns. She brought her own troops from Aquitaine and tried to influence military strategy, but male commanders resisted her participation, viewing it as inappropriate interference. Rumors circulated about her conduct during the campaign, whispers that followed her for the rest of her life, showing how a queen's reputation could become a weapon against her political ambitions. The end of Eleanor's marriage to Louis VII and her subsequent union with Henry II of England highlighted another aspect of queenly political power. In a time when divorce was nearly impossible, Eleanor annulled her first marriage on grounds of consanguinity, reclaimed her territories, and soon married the future King of England. This remarkable sequence of events required not only legal skill, but also careful political timing.